I am Trixie the Golden Witch, and this is the new Voidgazers Podcast. We have opinions about things, and now you can subscribe and download the podcast to hear those opinions. The new Voidgazers Podcast has a voicemail number and a new episode weekly. You can call 202-681-8643 or 202-681-VOID in order to leave a voicemail, and we'll play it on the show. Today, I am joined by usual co-host It's Mint Salad.
I'm Mint Salad, the absolute unit. It's the It's Mint Salad, and I draw the most good out there and review movies the bestest.
That you do. And I'm also joined by our very special guest today, Matt versus Japan.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Matt vs. Japan. I'm a Japanese expert, and I have a YouTube channel where I talk about how to get really fucking good at Japanese.
Excellent. That's exactly what I want to talk to you about, because I have a fan base full of anime fans who, many of whom probably have some cursory knowledge of Japanese. I took 3 years of Japanese classes in high school, and I learned basic structure from that, but like more of the actual vocabulary through just so much anime consumption.
I had a friend who learned Japanese next to me while I didn't learn at all. So that's my experience with Japanese.
That's your full exposure.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people end up like halfway learning Japanese or getting somewhat close, but like being naturalized or being able to speak like to Japanese people in the country is a whole different experience that I can't even really speak on, as I have not been to Japan. But Matt, you can help me out. How different is it? How difficult is it?
I mean, I would say it's not really a matter of being difficult. It's just a matter of time. Like getting fluent in Japanese probably takes around 10,000 hours. Maybe 5,000 hours to get to like a basic level of fluency if you're doing things efficiently. And most people just don't put in even a fraction of that amount of time. So that's why they never get good. Well, there's that and methodology. Most people also use really inefficient methodology as well. So yeah, if you have the right methodology and you put in the time, then I wouldn't say it's particularly difficult.
So your methodology that you are sort of known for pushing is like this high intensity, like get all those hours as quickly as possible, right?
Yeah, well, I guess my methodology is more than anything trying to not bullshit people and just tell them the reality about how many hours it's going to take. And because I think a lot of people, they don't really go into that because they're afraid it's going to scare people off. But I try to have my channel based around like, okay, if you actually want to do this, here are the facts. And if you want to get there in a reasonable amount of time, then you probably want to be doing it as quickly as you can. Because most people want to get fluent in Japanese like within a couple years, not in a couple decades, you know?
Yeah.
I've not seen a lot of channels like that. So the fact that you have a channel like that, I highly appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, his channel has all kinds of variety, too, because he also does, like, man-on-the-street stuff in Japan, and you've been invited onto Japanese television a few times, I believe just recently.
Yes, or starting this year. And the funny thing, actually, is I haven't actually been to Japan in 10 years. I was in Japan for 6 months as a high school student when I went to live out my anime fantasy. And after that, I came back to the US, and I haven't been back to Japan since. So I actually learned Japanese in the US. Like when I was in Japan, I still sucked at Japanese. When I got back from Japan, I still sucked at Japanese. So I got fluent in Japanese in the US and then have done everything I've done, including like those videos when I'm on the street talking to people. That was actually in the US, just finding Japanese people like in New York. And
I see.
And in Portland. And then, and I was on Japanese TV, like remotes, like they did a remote interview, had me trying to like report from America or be like American guy looking into Japan type of thing.
But this is why you are now planning to move to Japan so that you can like be live on Japanese TV, right?
Yeah, finally. Like, I don't know. At this point, I'm actually scheduled to fly to Japan in less than 2 weeks from now.
Wow.
So in hindsight, it's kind of like, I have no idea why I waited so long, you know, just a lot of different factors with the pandemic and stuff lining up. But so last I'll get to go to Japanese and actually, in a way, kind of get my revenge on Japan, because when I was in Japan 10 years ago and I sucked at Japanese, I actually had a really rough time, and it wasn't at all like anime. It kind of sucked.
Yeah.
So that's I think it's going to be different this time.
That's why the name is Matt versus Japan then. Like, it's your battle against the whole country to like
I guess
for redemption.
It kind of is. I mean, I chose that name before I ever went to Japan, but I think it does kind of express my mindset of just like, I went into this wanting to kind of conquer it in a way. Yeah. Which, I mean, I'm kind of embarrassed about that name now. Like, if I could go back, I would tell myself to choose a different name, because it almost sounds like I have I have a vendetta against Japan, like I'm against Japan or something, when it's quite the opposite, right? I love Japan, and that's why I want to master the language. So
I think the irony of that name will actually go over really well in Japan. I think they'll like that.
Hopefully.
Versus is a very popular, American pair of letters over there. I don't know how to describe that. Like a particle? Whatever.
Yeah, it's funny because they call it
that's the
buiesu. Instead
buiesu.
Of, like they generally say, like Matu buiesu Japan. That's how they say it.
Okay. So the movie Versus, would that movie be pronounced buiesu?
I'm not familiar with that movie. It's possible that in that particular case, it's like basasu or something.
Yeah, I think that is what it is. But yeah, that's interesting that it like they have a different word for the abbreviation versus the full word. That is
I think a lot of times they look at the spelling and no one tells them how to pronounce it. Like for the word white, they say howaito, and they have this ho in front of it, like howaito, even though of course we never say any H sound there. So
it's like a weird reversal of like trying to capture the WH in English, like just the fact that there is this extra letter there that they're like, well, why is there not a wahoaito, or like how that would make more sense in Japanese, but it's not pronounced anything like that, so they went with hoaito instead. It's fascinating.
They have their own weird logic. Like Costco, they say costoko, and there's lots of things.
That's very fun to say.
It is very fun to say. Costco.
Yeah.
Oh, well, my favorite one is McDonaldo. They say for
McDonaldo. Donaldo desu. I always think about that old meme of the Japanese Ronald McDonald meme, where he's like running around the park and dun look that up. Just look up Japanese McDonald's. You'll get what I'm talking about. It's a 10-year-old meme. Anyway, so Matt, you were talking about 10,000 hours, and that brings me back to, like, was that number inspired by the book Outliers by, goddamn, I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote it anymore.
Malcolm Gladwell?
That's the one, yes.
It was, so I was really inspired by this website called All Japanese All the Time, and that website, I think, did get that number from the book. So I'm getting it like secondhand from Malcolm Gladwell.
Yes. So to explain it to the audience, if anyone doesn't know, in this book Outliers, Gladwell basically suggests that every time there's been like an extremely successful person in their field, they always had about 10,000 hours of experience in what they were doing before the point at which they really blew up. And that 10,000 hours tends to be the least talked about part of the career of the person, like the Beatles grinding as like a jazz band in a club for like years before they blew up as the Beatles, or Bill Gates like having the opportunity to just sit and program for like 8 hours a day every day, before he programmed something that was meaningful that somebody would care about. And just it's the finding yourself with the opportunity to do something for that amount of time and taking advantage of it, is what will produce your sort of status as an outlier. And it's not that learning Japanese is like so difficult that it's like something only a extremely rare person can do, but at the same time it is kind of rare to find yourself like with the drive and circumstance to actually dedicate yourself to it, unless it's like hyper necessary to what you're trying to do. Like if your dream is to be a translator or like a flight attendant between America and Japan, or if you have family from Japan, like you're way more likely to learn Japanese than like if you are just totally disconnectedly, like coming into it as someone like me, a white American who just happened to grow up on Japanese television, I just grew up with a lot of Japanese cartoons, and that culture meant more to me for a lot of my life than American culture did. But like, it's never necessitated me to learn Japanese because I haven't moved to Japan, you know, and there's some part of me that's like attached to American values and thinks I might not have as good of a time if I lived in Japan, which is maybe why I haven't felt that pressure to learn the language. So I guess I'm going to ask you, like, you know, having been to Japan, having the experience you did and sort of fighting to go back, do you think that you like expect to enjoy life more there than here, or is it more like I'm going to go there to like do stuff like for a purpose?
I mean, I personally think I'm going to have a really good time in Japan, probably better than a time that I have here, just because being a white person who's fluent in Japanese makes you inherently kind of special in
That's true.
Japan. Like, it's not ideal that is the case, and a lot of people complain about that, of like, you know, because I have videos titled like "White Guy blows the mind of Japanese person" or whatever with perfect Japanese. People criticize that, but I mean, that's just the reality. And so, like, in America, no one really cares that I'm fluent in Japanese, except the odd Japanese person that I happen to stumble across. Whereas in Japan, that will kind of, you know, be a kind of something special that I think will open a lot of doors for me.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've already connected with a lot of Japanese people just through my YouTube channel and things like that, like had opportunities to go on TV and stuff like that. So I kind of feel like I have this ability that means nothing in America, but everything in Japan. So I think it's going to open a lot of doors for me.
Well, and I think the fact that you understand like your place in that and that you are charismatic in your approach and everything helps as well. Like, you're not, it's not just that you're white, you're like well-spoken and a good presenter, you know? So like, I think you deserve to be like on TV in Japan, like not just for being a white guy who speaks Japanese well, but like for, again, you have, you know, an interesting philosophy on how to learn. And, you know, and again, I think it's well presented. So
thank you. Thank you. Yeah. One of the things I'm hoping to do is actually start kind of a reverse YouTube channel where I speak all in Japanese and I tell Japanese people how to learn English through immersion using the same methods.
Ooh,
cool.
Yeah,
And
that's
so,
fun.
Because they really are lost when it comes to learning English right now. They, you know, try to study using textbooks and they don't actually expose themselves to real English. And I'm sure you guys have seen in anime, Japanese people, they don't have a good grasp on English. So I'm hoping to.
English is a really hard language, to be fair. Like,
it's like full of like other different languages. So I totally understand it.
Well, and
I
that's
think in general, when it comes to learning a language, the number one factor that determines the difficulty is how different or similar it is from your native language. So, for example, when a French person learns English, it's not that hard, right? But when a Japanese person tries to learn English, it is super hard because they're so different. But I kind of think like me learning Japanese is probably roughly similar to a Japanese person learning English because we're both traversing the same distance, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I definitely think that like because I've started using Duolingo and trying to catch back up to my Japanese knowledge as well as Spanish because my boyfriend is also learning Spanish through it. So like learning Spanish, it categorically is just like, okay, it's the same word as the English word, just like slightly different letters, you know, or even if it's a totally different word, it just means the same thing in almost all contexts. And like the main differences are grammatical and in like sort of the spirit of what's being said. And so there's definitely stuff that like would make sense to express in Spanish versus English, but they're so close that most stuff like it would just be contextual to who you're talking to, like which words you would use. Whereas with Japanese, it's so different in even the way that things are expressed that like for me, I do have like almost a different room in my mind for where Japanese words are, you know, like I go to a different place in my brain to speak Japanese or to have a Japanese reaction to something, if that makes sense. Like, say if I step outside and it's, oh, mabushi, you know, and it's different. It's different from it's just bright outside. No, it's this special, you know, like, and I've heard it so many times in so many media that like, whether or not it's even a thing that that Japanese people do all the time, probably media literate ones like me would, you know, people who have watched too much anime are going to step outside and go, mabushi. It's just not the same thing as anything in English. So like there's, you know, translation is like the effort to recapture the spirit and the literally what they're saying, but also like how would an American person say that thing? And that's where like the translation becomes difficult and why it's like, Yeah, like you said, there needs to be a level of immersion in order for you to really get what's being said beyond just like literally the words.
Yeah, and the fact that hearing you say all that, I think that's 100% spot on. And hearing you say that makes me think if you got a little more serious about learning Japanese, you would definitely pick it up way faster than most people. I guess all the anime does help, because that idea that they're not just saying the same thing but with like different words. They're actually expressing entirely different concepts at like the deepest level of thought is something that takes people a long time to grasp. And because of that, it not only messes up their comprehension, but when they try to speak, it messes it up even more, because you can't just take an English thought and then translate it into Japanese. You kind of have to have a Japanese thought the first time.
Exactly.
And if you are trying to say something and you don't have the Japanese thought, you're kind of already screwed. Right. So, I mean, what I try to do when I speak Japanese, instead of saying like, how do I say this in Japanese? I just try to think, what would a Japanese person say in this situation when they felt this emotion, and kind of frame the question that way. And then that helps you kind of leverage all the input that you've gotten and say something natural.
That's a really interesting. Yeah, I like that device as a way of checking yourself. I learned about a lot of those principles of translation because of the fact that I followed Andrew Cunningham, who is the translator he translated the Boogie Pop light novels and like a lot of the really early light novels that came to the U.S. Basically just out of passion, out of being like a big like Jojo fan and light novel fan who had, because he could understand Japanese, had read all this great, very influential stuff that hadn't been translated into English yet, and was like trying to help bring that culturally to America. Unfortunately, it took a while before light novels caught on, and when they did, it was like with the next wave of like Sword Art Online type stuff. And I don't know if Cunningham has done any like translation work recently, but he ran a blog called Eastern Standard back then. Hopefully it's still up somewhere, where he talked a lot about like the difficulties of translating stuff, especially like Bakemonogatari, which is known for being like really wordplay heavy and difficult to translate. And he wrote a whole article one time about how like he had translated a sentence and then realized that he thought it was Araragi talking, but it was actually Senjo Gahara. And so the way he translated the sentence, it was entirely different. Like, just it didn't even mean the same thing. Just because perspective-wise, like, there's no way that character meant this. They must have meant this. And, that's kind of a mind blow, and it makes you think, like, God, how meticulous it can be to like translating can be as meticulous as writing the original material, because you have to understand the original material on a level that you can make it make sense in a totally other language.
Yeah, I mean, people say a lot that translation is basically its own creation. And that's actually why personally I'm not that interested in translation, and I've never been, because even the best possible translation still can't fully capture all the nuance of the original. And a lot is always lost. So especially like if you're translating something that you think is really beautiful, then what it feels like subjectively is just you kind of like tarnishing this like beloved original and seeing like how it's like sand slipping through your hands. And the best you can do is try to like minimize the number of grains that slip through, even though there's inevitably going to be a whole bunch. So I kind of feel like I learned Japanese so that I could like get rid of translation. So the last thing I want to do is go back into translation land. Although I do some translation work.
That's fascinating. No, I love your perspective on that. My whole job is ruining art. So I'm like I would love to translate. Because I really do think I think of my job as already translation. Like I'm taking a piece of work and I'm trying to put words to it to make it make more sense to people. But at the same time, I know that I don't understand. Like I know I don't understand everything that the author put into it. There's just no way. Like no matter how good I am at understanding the author, even if I talk to them directly, there's going to be a level on which they just can't communicate some of it, and I'll never completely understand it. But like at the very least, I pride myself on trying to understand the people who create the stuff well enough that I can speak on their behalf without offending them. Granted, I've mostly talked about anime, and it's always been funny because I have that distance from the people where, like, I was able to be very critical when I thought that none of these people will ever see these videos. You know, like I never wanted, you know, to like ruin some poor animator's life by like pointing out how shitty they are. But I just figured, like, yeah, the Japanese audience, like you said, not a lot of Japanese people really know English very well. Certainly not well enough to watch my videos without translation. And the only one of my videos that I know has been translated into Japanese and was successful on Nico Nico Doga, like uploaded by somebody else, was my Kimono Friends video. And that was like because it was a big deal on Nico Nico Doga at the time, you know, and it was probably interesting to hear a Westerner who was praising it the same way that a lot of the Japanese audience was. But that's like the only time that something I did was culturally relevant enough to the Japanese fan base to be like worth translating and making popular on Nico, you know? But if I knew Japanese on like a naturalistic level, I would just write some of my videos in Japanese. And for me, yeah, it is mostly about getting to read stuff that isn't translated. I've never been able to get into manga in the way that other people do because of the fact that most of the manga that looks interesting to me has never been translated. And every time I see like somebody who there's a blogger named Ogiwe Maniacs, for instance, who SD Shamshell. He's done a bunch of like panels at cons and stuff, so some people might have heard of him, but he like, you know, learned Japanese and then started reading Japanese manga and then talking about like, you know, writing articles about these cool manga and describing their plot. And I'm like, I want to fucking read it, but I can't. And so that's been my biggest motivation. But if I did learn Japanese on that level, I think the fact that I can be a translator makes me very tempted to do it. Like, I would probably do it just for fun because it's close enough to what I do already. And like, it is, you know, even if I'm still kind of tarnishing the work, at least it's like much closer than analysis. Like I'm just like I'm trying to literally bring you as close to the exact words the author used as possible. You know, that's a lot closer to direct translation than what I do currently, which is like abstract, opinionated translation. You know.
Yeah, well, I think you would be a really good translator because of that. Because of that perspective. Like, I can imagine somebody who is arrogant enough to think they 100% understand the original probably is understanding much less of the original than someone who's being really thoughtful about it like you are, and then they probably miss tons of stuff. But for me, the motivations that I feel, like, even though in general that's my stance on translation, that I'm not interested in it, of course there are moments when I feel the urge to translate, and that's usually just when I find something that I think is just really amazing and it has not been translated, and I just feel like, oh, I can't believe all you guys are missing out. And then I kind of want to translate it, although I normally don't because it's too much work, so I give up after like 10 seconds, so I like rethink it. But the other thing that's even more is when I just see like a shitty translation. And I see all these English people, like English speakers, consuming this translation thinking that it's an accurate representation when it's totally off. That like makes me really angry, and so then I want to be like, no, he's not, that's not what he's saying at all.
If I ever do get into translation, I'm going to make a point out of like trying to standardize the way things are translated into English, just because to me, like, meta contextually, like watching so much anime, you hear the same phrases come up again and again and again in different shows, and oftentimes meaning the same thing, or like the fact that it is so common is part of the joke. And so when that gets translated differently in different shows, like that meta context is lost as like, and I understand that like most anime fans are not fans of all anime holistically the way that I am, where like I care about all of it and how it's all connected in the bigger picture. But like, you do, I guess anybody who cares that much probably will get to a point where they understand Japanese well enough to start picking up on these things and not need it to be translated, but it would expedite that process a lot, and I would have to explain a lot less to people if, like, you know, if it was easy to catch on to all the commonalities in the phrasings. Like Bakaraptor, who's another blogger, a friend of mine who learned Japanese, moved to Japan. He currently works as a lawyer in Japan. He recently got married over there and everything. So he's like, you know, he's a Japanese person now for all intents and purposes. He had a Japanese style wedding and everything. But he had at one point, I forgot why I was talking about him because I was picturing the wedding photo and just thinking about how fun that is. But, this was my friend from back in the blogger days who had said that when you're watching anime, characters who are under 18 all talk like babies, and anybody who's over 18 is incomprehensible. Like the language difference between it's like a way of presenting a character's age. It's just like if they're a kid, then they're like, oh, everything's fua, and like, everything, like they're constantly expressing themselves in sound effects and emotional dialogue and like just rote kind of like cliches. And then the adults are like always like dumping long-winded techno babble and stuff, and they all talk like military or like very proper and use like old-fashioned words and stuff. And it's like as somebody learning Japanese, like the difference in how easily you can understand certain shows, like it's like this massive gulf between like a show like K-On! You could probably not even understand Japanese and watch it and know what's going on. And then like any mecha show is going to be totally incomprehensible.
Yeah, that's so true. It's so funny hearing you talk. It's like, seems like I would think you could totally fool me that you're already fluent in Japanese by the way you talk about it.
It's just because I've followed all these blogs.
But yeah, that's such a truism in learning Japanese, where like getting to the point, like for people who take the type of method that I'm talking about and they learn Japanese really hardcore, getting to the point where they can watch shows like K-On! With no subs and like understand almost everything takes like 1 year around. Whereas getting to the point where you could understand, like Fate Zero or Psycho Pass or like a Gundam show, that takes like 3-4 years if you're going like really hardcore. And it's just the difference is so stark. Like people talk about like understanding anime without the subs as if it's one thing, but yeah, the difficulty levels are huge. And in fact, normal everyday conversation is on the easy side of that. Like I'd say being able to just go and talk to a Japanese person on the street, that's like 1 or 2 levels above K-On! Maybe, so that's like level 3 or 4 or something, whereas like Gundam is like 10. And so there's actually a lot of people who people who aren't into anime or aren't really into media, and they just like live in Japan, and they might have a Japanese job and a Japanese wife and live their whole life in Japanese, but they haven't really dived hardcore into that type of media. They still won't be able to understand shows like Fate Zero with no subtitles on.
Right.
Whereas, for me, I when I was, especially the first couple of years, I was like learning entirely for anime, and so I made like thousands of flashcards to learn like every weird word that came up in Fate Zero and like the light novels of Ginga Eiyu Densetsu, what I call that, Legends of the
Galactic Heroes,
and things like that. And so because of that, I ended up with like a crazy vocabulary, and I know a bunch of words that like Japanese people don't know because of that. Like my girlfriend, she's a grad student right now. She's like pretty educated, but she will regularly like ask me what words mean or how to read a kanji that she doesn't know, and I'll like know what they are because that came up like in one of the Monogatari books, and I made a flashcard for it and I memorized it. Whereas Japanese people don't do that. So that's the other thing. I think there is a gap between like the average vocabulary of an otaku and the average vocabulary of a non-otaku in Japan is also pretty stark, I think.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that like just because it's in Japanese doesn't mean that every Japanese person would understand it. Like there are American TV shows that I like struggle to follow, like if I'm watching like an Aaron Sorkin show, I'm going to have to really be at full tilt mentally to like, get all the references being made like politically and all that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't expect just any random Japanese person to be able to like totally comprehend some like high sci-fi fantasy shit that comes on at 12 a.m. and especially if it's like something like Gundam is actually well written in a way that I do think like contextually, even if you don't know all the words, you could figure out what's happening. There are lots of anime that are like, I'm thinking of like Book of Bantora. Like that's a show that I can't even understand with subtitles. So like I know there's got to be people who just click that on and they're like, yeah, this is nonsense. And that's where like the whole Chunibyo thing really comes from, is like making fun of the pretentiousness of people who like stuff all these huge words in and like obscure kanji and all that. Like, that was the whole joke with Kuroneko from Oreimo, was like she just like watches shows like that and tries to replicate it and seem as smart as possible by using like old slang and shit that nobody understands, and like everyone hates her for it, you know. Like it's that like that desire to like prove something, like, look how smart I am, I know all the words, and it comes through in a lot of otaku media, which, you know, a lot of it is like bred from and for insecurity, so it's kind of understandable.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I will watch a lot of Japanese learners go through that kind of similar stage. Like, I know I had it really bad. I had my own chuni stage where whenever I wrote Japanese, I would write it in like the style of a light novel. Like, there's still this post that I made in like, I think it was like 2014 or something. There's this like language learning website where you can write like in Japanese and Japanese people will correct you. And then, you know, they write in English and you correct them.
That's fun.
It was called Lang 8. I don't know if it still exists. But I remember there's a post on there that I wrote like about, it's just like a paragraph about me being bored in science class or something at college. And it's like written completely like a light novel. And it's like the cringiest thing ever now. But I remember thinking back then, like, oh man, I got to publish my own light novel soon. Like I'm getting pretty good at this thing. And I thought it was really cool.
I'm in a never-ending Chunibyo phase currently. I still write light novels that are still cringeworthy, and so I'll be there for the rest of my life. This is not a call-out post to anybody, no matter how pretentious your writing might be. We're all in this together.
Well, the thing that I see that like I used to do is like, I mean, if you're writing, I think that's totally cool. The thing you got to watch out for is like actually trying to speak to Japanese people and like show off your knowledge of how many words you know and how much kanji you know, because like they will just think you don't understand Japanese. Like they will, and in a way you don't, right? Because you don't understand how unnatural it is in a certain context. Like even I think like Nishio Ishin or whatever, people who are like gods of Chunibyo written Japanese, I'm pretty sure they still talk like a normal person. Like that's the thing, is almost nobody actually speaks Chunibyo in real life. I remember a time when I was first learning Japanese where I was like, I don't care if no one speaks like Araragi. I am going to speak like Araragi in Japanese, just cause. But in hindsight, you just sound really weird, unfortunately. Yeah,
the naturalization. Honestly, like I've always felt like I would probably do pretty fine if I was just like, you know, touristing around Japan, because like most of like the everyday communication can be done with your hands. Like, you know, if I go into McDonald's and I hold up 5, they're going to know I want the number 5. You know, like there's enough familiarity and stuff that like knowing tons of words won't do you as well as like just understanding basic human, like, you know, gestures and like implications with your body and voice, or saying it in a Japanesey way. Also, like it's funny how many people think it would be racist to like speak English in a like forced accent, but it would actually help you a lot in Japan, because like people have to realize that in Japanese there are only 5 vowel sounds that exist, and everything is just like everything is syllables. So now I'm like getting into actually talking about basic Japanese, but like if anybody doesn't know this, like the Japanese language is like a, I, u, e, o, kaki, ku, keko, sashi, su, se, so, but it's like you speak in syllables. So to translate English into Japanese, you have to say like mai computer, you know, like that's my computer. But like if you're speaking to a Japanese person, you say my computer versus my computer, they will probably know what you're talking about better if you say it like that, which actually, you know, especially because computer is actually just the word for it in Japan also. But
yeah, like if you say like my computer, this is what a Japanese person hears. Like that's literally all their brain processes. And and it's funny because Japanese people will do an impression of that. Like I've seen Japanese people do an impression of what English sounds like to them, and it's literally just like their ears don't hear those sounds. So yeah, that's totally true.
Which, in fairness, is also how I feel listening to Chinese, is that it's like even more compressed than English and even harder to parse out like where words begin and end, whereas like Japanese is so orderly, you know, it's literally syllable by syllable. Now granted, like, you know, people who live out in the sticks or whatever are going to have like country accents, and they're going to slur it all together the way that, you know, American country accents do. Like when I say that the words are compressed, like, you know, I'm speaking very fully right now. Like I'm speaking out every word to the full extent I could, and it's still like there's so many letters in some of these words compared to like in Japanese. There's just no wasted space. It's every character is a syllable, period. You know, there's not like there's nothing like the word through where you've got THROUGH and that's all one fucking syllable somehow. Like that just wouldn't happen in Japanese, you know? Like
every syllable is either one vowel or one consonant plus one vowel. And every consonant has to be followed by a vowel. That's why a Japanese person can't just say like
with the exception of the letter N.
Yes, for some reason, things can end in the letter N, but anything else has to end with a vowel. So you can't just say cup. You have to say koppu, and there has to be that u at the end. Yeah,
and then there's also like there is like a glottal stop as well, where you can add like a double consonant. So like it could be kapu as opposed to kapu, but like that's the
you still
that's
have
the
to
full
eventually
extent of it.
have that u at the end.
Yeah, there can't be nothing. That's why a lot of our audience has probably seen the Shiritori game that comes up in anime all the time. And the reason that game makes sense is that it's like whatever the last vowel, or rather the last syllable of the word is. So like if I say, Shiritori, then you have to follow that up with like Rikota, and then I could follow that up with Tai-chi, and then you could say Chi So Ne or whatever. But if you end in the letter N, there's no way like to continue from that because it's the only hard stop in the language. So if I say, I can't think of a word that ends in an N off the top of my head. Whatever. If I end in an N, you can't continue from it. Noon. Yeah. If I say noon, then I lose because, I came up with something that couldn't be.
So no word starts with the N sound.
So the idea of the game is that it just goes until one of you accidentally comes up with a word that ends in an N without thinking about it because you've been playing the game for so long that you've started to forget the rules. Or run out of ideas.
Yeah. And they normally will have like a topic. They'll be like, okay, we'll play food shiritori. So every word has to be related to food. And that makes it actually hard. Because if it was just like any word, obviously you could do like the whole dictionary. Yeah.
But and then it's just like a contest to see who forgets to pick the wrong word first. Speaking of contests, I have a quiz show planned for this. I have a special guest I want to bring in. Cranberry Dave, and he has a bunch
legendary hip hop producer,
Cranberry Dave, leader of Sucker Punch, our hip hop collective group. You can listen to all of our music right here on the ASE Presents channel. And Dave is going to be asking us trivia questions. We are going to be having answers or not, depending on our cultural knowledge of Japanese. So Dave, come over here, give us our first trivia question.
What is Japan called in Japanese?
Ooh. Mint, do you know what Japan is called in Japanese?
Japonese?
Yeah, why do you think that, Mint? Why was that your...
Well, the answer is I don't know, and I just wanted to say it in Spanish.
Oh my God. I believe the answer is Nihon, right?
Oh.
Matt, is that correct?
Way off.
Yes, that's like the most standard normal way to say it. They have a more formal way called Nippon that you'll hear if you watch Code Geass. They always use that one. But yeah, Nihon is by far the most common way.
I always understood Nippon to be sort of more like maybe not nationalistic, but like prideful way of saying it.
Yeah, it definitely has that like association.
Okay. Yeah, I think of Nipponichi, of course, the game developer. But yeah, all right.
Do you know
Dave,
what that means?
What, Nipponichi? Yeah.
Nihon.
Nihon is Japan.
Well, do you know what...
Okay. if this is the next question.
No. This isn't the next question. This is a little fun fact that I'm adding on to the end. The kanji that put it together mean the sun's origin.
Oh.
So that's where the name Land of the Rising Sun comes from. Because it's like the horizon.
Nihon is literally means like where the sun comes from. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And there's a little historical story that goes with that, where basically back in the day, like this is probably 1,500 years ago, China was the center of civilization, and Japan was like this really kind of like they didn't really have any technology yet. They didn't have like agriculture or metal or anything. So from China's point of view, Japan was this really barbaric, like undeveloped place. And so China referred to Japan using this really derogatory term. Like they're just like refer to them as, hey, you dipshits. And then this one Japanese like high up politician took a boat over to China, and he was like, hey, can you stop calling this that? Instead, call us the land of the rising sun. Because from China's point of view, Japan was it was in the direction that the sun rises in. And so, hey, it has that little story. And that guy who was the one who did that, he comes up in I think he's like makes a couple of appearances in a bunch of anime. He was like on the $100 bill, with the Japanese equivalent of the $100 bill for a while. His name's Shoto Kutaishi. He was like legend to be able to listen to 20 conversations at once and hear them all. So, he's lends himself well to anime.
I have heard of that dude. I think there might be like a Toho character based on him too. Interesting. All right, Dave, tell us about the next trivia question.
In which Japanese city can you find Godzilla Street?
Godzilla Street?
Godzilla
Tokyo?
Well, I'm going to say...
let me say it with my chest. Tokyo.
I'm going to say Shinjuku. I have no idea. Matt, do you know the answer to this?
No, I don't know this. I mean, I would guess somewhere in Tokyo as well, but I don't know.
Well, here's the thing. You're both right.
Like, wait, it is Shinjuku?
Yeah.
Oh, that's incredible. That was just like the first city in Tokyo that came to mind.
That's impressive.
Is there any more to that, or is just...
No, just...
All right, let's hit the next one.
What was the first anime that Studio Trigger made?
Ooh. I know the answer to this. Mint, do you?
I don't know I've heard the name, but I don't know which animes they've created, so...
The answer is Kill La Kill.
That's not fun.
No?
I almost knew. I thought it was Kill la Kill, but I wasn't sure if that was their first famous one or literally their first show they ever made.
It was definitely their first show. Dave, next question.
Hell yeah. What does sushi mean in Japanese?
Sushi. I do not know.
Does sushi mean something? I've never thought about that. I mean, there's a couple different kanji that you can write it with. The most common, or one of the common ways to write it is with the character for like longevity, and then the character for like control or power, kind of.
I can only think of, whenever I imagine sushi, I can only think of the fish and the rice. And so, like, is that even, like, tradition, is that, like, in all sushi, fish and rice is, like, a common thread? Because that's my answer.
I don't think you have to have fish in sushi, because...
Oh.
What is the answer, Dave?
The answer is sour rice.
Oh.
That's the thing about sushi is the main component is not the fish, it's the rice, which is prepared in rice vinegar. So it's sour.
Okay. Yeah, that's like, you gotta have the rice with the sushi. I get you. Okay.
We all learned. What's the next one?
This is a multiple choice one. Who directed Neon Genesis Evangelion? A. Nobuo Uematsu. B. Hayao Miyazaki. C. Hideaki Anno. Or D. Shinichiro Watanabe.
Miyazaki just is my answer.
I know this one.
What's well, okay, I do too. Do you want to go first?
Sure, Hideki Anno.
Yes, and the other options, Nobuo Uematsu is the composer for the Final Fantasy series, Hayao Miyazaki, lead director of the Studio Ghibli films. Who was the last option you said?
Watanabe.
Oh, Shinichiro Watanabe, who directed Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo and Space Dandy. But Hideaki Anno is a personal icon of mine, so of course I do that. Matt, are you a big Eva fan yourself?
Oh yeah, I'm a pretty big fan. Actually, I haven't watched the final rebuild one yet, but I'm a fan of the original series.
Well, how do you feel about the other three rebuilds?
I mean, I kind of feel like I can't judge them until I've seen the complete set in a way.
Okay.
But it didn't. I mean, especially Q, it kind of felt like it was, I don't know, I didn't really know where it was going.
That was how I felt too, but I was pretty satisfied by the last one. So I think you might be as well.
Okay,
but
cool. It's been on my list too. Like I gotta it's been way too long, so I need to rewatch the whole set and then the final one.
Yeah, I had to. I like watched. I think I like rewatched them, watched the fourth one, and then rewatched all of them again just to be like sure I understood what the hell I had just seen. Basically, all right. What's the next question, Dave?
Before it was Tokyo, what was the capital of Japan?
I don't know any other cities in Japan.
You don't know any cities other than Tokyo? Not even Kyoto?
That's my answer. Kyoto.
I don't know. I don't remember. I think that might have been at one point. Wait, is this like right before Tokyo? Because there's been like multiples.
Do you mean before the name became Tokyo, or before it was in the location of Tokyo?
Before both.
Okay. Is that just because you have both answers on you? Okay. I'm pretty sure that it was Kyoto, and then it moved to Edo, and then Edo became Tokyo.
Correct.
Okay. I assume, Matt, you already knew all that. Yeah. Why did they move it from Kyoto to Edo?
I think that had to do with political reasons. Like when the Edo period started, that had to do with the new like samurai government, the Bakufu, getting created. Okay. I think that's kind of like around what. And then then there was this Bakufu government, and then there were these samurais trying to take down the government, and that's kind of what Gintama is about, like around there.
Yes, and like Rurouni Kenshin, I think, also stationed around that point, right? Like I think that's when Edo had just become the capital.
Actually, I think Rurouni Kenshin's right when the Edo ended and it became Meiji.
Oh, okay.
And
wow, I guess I had just always thought that Gintama and Kenshin were like set in the same period, but
what they have in common was that when, and I'm not like this is not my expertise, so sorry if there's like some inaccuracies, but I think when it changed from Edo to Meiji, that's when they like banned samurais and banned swords, and they returned the basically power of the government from the like samurai people to the actual emperor. And so that's at the beginning of Rurouni Kenshin, where he's like suddenly now he used to be like a superstar samurai, and now that's been all like outlawed. And so he's kind of like an outlaw because he has a sword and stuff. And that's kind of similar in Gintama because the aliens like have a similar thing when they're like, okay, no more swords and stuff like that.
Right. So it's like as though the aliens showed up like earlier into the Edo period and then brought like the Meiji period early almost.
Yeah, pretty much. And then instead of the emperor ruling, it was like the aliens ruling.
Fascinating. All right. Do we have another quiz question for us?
Oh, I got questions for days. This next one's also a multiple choice. How many JoJos are there in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure? A, 3, B, 7, C, 5, or D, 8?
I'm going to guess 7.
Matt,
I would guess 5. I've only seen part of JoJo.
I think there's 8, right?
There are 8.
Yes.
Oh, I should just guess the biggest number.
Yeah, because I was thinking, I know there's at least 8 parts of JoJo, and I'm pretty sure there's one JoJo per part at least. So
I see.
I thought the trick was going to be, like, if there had been a higher number, I probably would have guessed that, thinking it was a trick that, like, oh, there's an extra JoJo somewhere in there. But luckily that wasn't the case. All right, give me the next question.
What is the name of Japan's national parliament?
I do know this.
Oh, the government, but spell MINT.
Oh my god. It's called the Diet, right?
Correct.
Yes.
The Diet?
Matt, what's the Diet about?
I was actually, that's funny, because I was about to answer a Japanese word. I was like, naikaku. But,
so that's like an even deeper way of saying it then.
Well, I guess.
Naikaku.
Well, a diet, is that a Japanese? That's not a Japanese word, is it?
No, I don't think so.
I think that's just how we say it refer to it in English, right?
Yeah.
Whereas naikaku is, I think, what they call it in Japanese. But excellent. Yeah, Japan has a pretty complicated political system. I've been learning more about it recently. But yeah, they have like this thing called Sangin and Shugin. I only know it all in Japanese, so it's like impossible to explain it. but they have, it's kind of like, I guess, kind of like we have senators and House of Representatives. They have like two different kind of groups of politicians like that. And then they have the prime minister. But the interesting thing about Japanese politics is that basically the same political party has been in power pretty much since after World War II, with like very few exceptions. So there's like realistically only one political power or one political party that's ever had power in Japan.
Incredible. That's some longevity.
I did not. Wow.
All right, Dave, next question.
What is the name of the Japanese sun goddess?
Man, I don't know. Sun. What was Japan? What was Japan?
Nihon? Is that what you were going to guess?
Nihon Nani?
I think I know the answer. Matt, do you know the answer to this
I know
one?
it too.
Okay, it's Amaterasu. Yes, because you can play as her in Okami for the PS2.
I thought you would know.
Also, Satsuki from Kill La Kill is like based on Amaterasu to some degree.
Oh, really?
Like she like symbolically represents that character. I saw a great panel on this one time by Charles Dunbar. So look into that if you're interested. What's the next trivia question?
In Cowboy Bebop, what dish is Jet Black known for making?
I know the answer to
Chili?
this. What did you say?
Big bean chili?
Oh, chili?
Yeah.
Matt, do you know this one?
Oh, it's been way too long since I watched Cowboy Bebop. I know it's something with no meat, right? Was it a mushroom?
You are
thing?
correct about that. Well, it's is it a mushroom? Well, he does make mushroom dishes at one point in the show, but it's specifically bell peppers and beef. But there is there's no actual beef. He just calls it that to cope, basically.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Can't believe I forgot that.
Next one, Dave.
I got a couple more for you. Which flower is the symbol of the Japanese imperial family?
Oh, shit.
Oh, boy.
Mint, pick a flower.
A dandelion. Did you know you can eat dandelions?
Matt, do you know this one?
No, I should know this.
Ooh, Is it, okay, well, I'm going to try the most obvious sounding thing. It's Sakura Blossom.
That's what you'd think. It's the chrysanthemum.
Repeat that?
The chrysanthemum.
Oh, that's a good
chrysanthemum.
drink. The honey chrysanthemum drink is pretty delicious, so I see why. It's great.
Well, I'm glad it's not Sakura, because if it was and I didn't know it, then I would feel really dumb.
Really silly, yeah, me too. Well, chrysanthemums are cooler. I keep picturing, like, I know there's like a flag that has like 5 petals on it that has something to do with something, but I guess that wasn't the answer because chrysanthemum doesn't look like that. So anyway, continue with the next trivia question, Dave.
All right. Who is the best Naruto character? This is a multiple choice. All right. A, Naruto. B, Sasuke. C, Ichigo. D, Sakura.
Mint, who's the best Naruto character?
Naruto.
I mean, that's a pretty safe bet, I would probably think, considering the show's named after him. Matt, who do you think is the best Naruto character?
I'm tied between Ichigo and Sasuke.
Tied between them. You got to pick one or the other.
Okay, I'm going with Sasuke then.
Okay, you saved yourself.
There's only room in those shows for one of those two.
Well, I guess if you've picked Naruto and Sasuke, then I have to pick Sakura because Ichigo is from Bleach. Who is the correct answer?
Naruto, obviously. It's
Goku.
named after him.
It's Goku versus Superman. Of course, Goku could beat Superman and Naruto's granddaddy and whoever else. I don't know. There's a fox, I think. I've never seen it.
Okay, what's the next?
That's it. That's
the last one. Thank you for that,
Thank
Dave.
you.
That was magnificent.
That's part of the show. Next time, only that part.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I'm impressed. Yeah, you almost knew all the ones that I knew, didn't you? Even about the ones about Japan.
I was wondering if Dave would be able to find questions that like neither of us would know the answer to, because he's not as much of an expert in Japanese culture, but he seems to be an expert in finding trivia questions. As like we both got stumped, so I feel like that was a good job, Dave.
Thank you.
Anyway, Matt, I want to talk about what you've got coming up. You say you're moving to Japan soon. Do you already have a sense of like what you're going to be doing there, or is it more like let's see what happens?
Well, I'm going as a student, and that was mostly for just visa considerations, because getting a visa to go to Japan is really hard right now. Like, they're still not letting independent tourists go, and don't know when they will be. So I got the student visa because it was like a good way to go for a year. But because of that, I have to actually like go to school and take classes, which I'm not super psyched about. But I have that. And then I'm also actually recently I've been doing some work with a Japanese marketing company, which has been pretty cool. That just kind of started recently. So I'm going to keep working on them. And then, yeah, I want to keep making content about how to learn Japanese on my YouTube channel. And I'm imagining that living in Japan and going from, doing Japanese all the time in America to doing Japanese all the time in Japan will hopefully, allow me to have some pretty interesting shifts in perspective. So I definitely want to share that with everyone else. And like I said, I within the next maybe at least 6 months, I'm hoping to also start that other YouTube channel where I talk in Japanese to Japanese people about how to learn English and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I take it you're probably planning to move somewhere in Tokyo, or are you going to like a different part of the country?
So I wanted to go to Tokyo, but I'm actually going to Osaka just because.
Okay. Cool.
So yeah, how it worked out was I never graduated from college, but I also never officially dropped out. So even though I haven't gone to school in years, I'm still technically a student at this university, and they have exchange programs where you can go to Japan and it's like pretty cheap. So I was limited to what programs they had, and they didn't have one that went to Tokyo. So rather than going to some place that's like kind of near Tokyo, but ultimately like kind of rural, I figured it'd be better to just go to like a big city. So I'm going to Osaka.
I've heard a lot of great things about Osaka. That's my brother's visited Japan a couple times, and that's his favorite like part of it. Are you concerned at all about the Osaka Ben, like the accents?
It's really funny that you asked that. I am, because actually one of the things that within the Japanese learning community that I'm pretty known for is this thing called pitch accent, which is basically a really important aspect of Japanese pronunciation that is extremely neglected within the Japanese community. Basically, every Japanese word gets pronounced with like a certain melody, like a high-low melody. It's kind of like in English, we have stress accent, which means for one syllable in every word, we put extra stress on it, right? Like if I say like addict, then I'm talking about a noun. But if I say addict and I put the emphasis on the second half, then it's a verb type of thing.
Yeah.
And so similarly, instead of it being kind of like strong versus weak, in Japan, it's high versus low. So if I say like hashi, where it goes high to low, hashi, that means chopsticks. But if I say hashi, then that means bridge. And so, yeah, it's really important. Like Japanese people are really tuned into this. And if someone says something with the wrong pitch accent, they'll be like, yo, it's not like that. It's like this.
Yeah,
Speak correctly.
The biggest criticism I get of when I use Japanese words in videos and pronounce names and stuff is definitely this, like that I tend to pronounce it English style, which is to put emphasis on one part. I keep thinking of the word kokoro, and I'm thinking like the way I would naturally tend to say it would probably be kokoro. Like, my kokoro. Whereas it's, I imagine, meant to be like kokoro? Or like,
this one would be low, high, high. And the interesting point is that the next word has to be low. So it's like kokoro desu. And if you said kokoro desu with the des high, then that would make it wrong. So that's the extra tricky part, is it's not just the pitch of the word, but also the pitch of what comes right after it too is like determined by the word.
Oh man, that's like a level of OCD that we poor Westerners don't realize we're stepping ourselves into the crossfires of being judged by. That's brutal.
I love it. It's also fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the interesting thing about it is that even if you totally mess it up, they'll still understand you. And this makes it a little different than like tones in Chinese. Like if you're familiar, Chinese, like Mandarin Chinese has tones which are kind of similar. But if you mess up the tones in Chinese, like they literally won't know what you're saying. Whereas in Japanese, you can mess up the pitch accent and you'll just sound like a foreigner and sound really foreign, but they'll still understand you. And so I think, honestly, most Japanese textbooks, they just don't mention it at all because they're kind of just like, Japanese is hard enough. And these people probably are going to suck anyway. So why put another meaningless thing on their plate? But for people like me who want to get as good as possible, it's like really important. And in fact, this is something that no one told me about. And so I was like 5 years into learning Japanese and I was already really fluent, but I knew that I didn't sound fully native. And so when I asked my Japanese friends, like, what makes me sound not Japanese? Basically told me, it's like, oh, well, you go up and down in all the wrong places and it sounds really weird. And so that was when I got into it, and I had to study it afterwards and go back and kind of like literally relearn the pitch of every single word in Japanese because I learned it without the pitch. And but it was totally worth it because I sound way better now, and I can totally tell the way that Japanese people respond to me when I actually speak is completely different. But the thing is, different dialects of Japanese have different pitch accent. So actually, the biggest difference, more than anything else, between like Tokyo standard Japanese and the Kansai dialect is actually pitch accent. Like even more than the individual words, they have totally different pitch accents. So like the way that you said like kokoro, that's how they'd say it in Tokyo. In Kansai, they'd actually say kokoro, and they'd say it like high, low, low, pretty much how you said it. And so
interesting. I feel like I'd fit in better in Osaka. Because I know that they stereotypically it's like they speak rough. It's like a New York accent. Almost.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's also associated with humor a lot. Like most comedians in Japan are from Osaka, and so they're considered to be like really serious about comedy. And there's all these this thing that is always said is that like do you know what an ochi is in Japanese?
I do not.
It's basically like the punchline of a joke, or kind of like the end of a story that where it's kind of like the punchline of a story that makes it all funny, you know?
Okay.
And so in Kansai, whenever you tell a story, or pretty much whenever you're like going to explain anything, there has to be some kind of ochi, right? To like make it worth listening for. But in Tokyo, they don't have that culture. And so apparently Kansai people are always complaining that talking to Tokyo people is so boring because they're not funny at all. They don't have the ochi. They just say a story with no points. And then
this
they're just
literally like New York versus LA. Like it's totally like that.
So yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to going to Kansai for that aspect. I'm hoping they can like train up my comedy muscles and I can be like funny in Japanese. But the other thing is like, I just spent all these years training my Tokyo pitch accent, and now I'm going to a place that has like totally different pitch accent. So I might end up with like a mix match pitch accent, and all my hard work might go down the drain. But I'm trying to actually see if I can become like bilingual within Japanese and be able to like switch on and off on command. That's kind of what I'm hoping to go for.
I mean, I could speak in a few different English accents, so I don't see why it couldn't be done. You know,
there you go.
But yeah, like my Japanese teacher in my third year was a Russian guy who had learned like I think like 5 or 7 years or something of Japanese, all through college and stuff, and they taught him very proper Tokyo Japanese, and then he ended up moving to Aomori Prefecture, which is the far north and the sticks. And he said he arrived and he's all alone, fresh out of college, arrives in Aomori, and he can't understand what anyone is saying. Like, it was just so different of an accent from what he learned, and like it took him months to pick it up enough to like be able to fucking like live. And eventually he ended up teaching in Japan. Like I think he was teaching English, because he also knew English, to Japanese students, and then moved to America to teach Japanese to English students. And that turned out to be a nightmare for him, because American schools are not nearly as great as Japanese schools, particularly in terms of student conduct. So we drove that poor guy insane. Like, he just couldn't handle the level of like disobedience and like lack of giving a fuck that American students have. So at least at my school, I didn't go to an amazing school. So
perhaps maybe you were slightly influenced. Maybe he had like Aomori influenced Japanese pronunciation. Maybe you like picked that up a little bit.
Oh, that's possible. Yeah. I think of that as like the horror story of like, because you were saying how your first trip to Japan was kind of like, it didn't go so well because you didn't know the language as well as you hoped.
And I was in Gunma, by the way. There's actually one famous anime that takes place in Gunma. Want to guess what it is?
Is it Higurashi?
No,
not
initial D.
Koroni. Oh, okay. So the place with the 5 hairpoint pin turns on the mountain.
Yes. So actually, the funny thing is I'd watched Initial D right before I found out that I was going to Gunma. And of course, this is just like the teacher you were saying. I didn't have any choice in the matter. It's just where the program sent me. Mm-hmm. And so I had watched Initial D. I was like, oh, awesome. This is I love, I'm going to go look at all the drift spots and it should be cool.
Yeah.
But it turns out that besides Initial D, Gunma's like one of the most boring places in Japan, and they don't really have like anything going for it. It's kind of just like a kind of rural, kind of urban, like boring place.
I think that might have been kind of the joke in Initial D is like, but like it's the most boring place in the world, and then they start doing drift racing on the mountain to like do the most exciting thing imaginable because it's like so boring there.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, then they go in the later seasons, right, to like all the neighboring prefectures that are all more exciting. And then they beat them all. Yeah. So it kind of makes sense.
It does make sense. So you ended up in a boring place and just there was nothing to do. And like,
well, especially because the school they sent me to was like a serious, like a school that was for people who wanted to get into like a really good university. Like as most people who've seen anime probably know, in like America, most people just go to whatever high school is like closest to their house. Right. But Japanese people actually take a like entrance exam to enter a high school. And so because of this, people generally go to like the most challenging high school they can. And everyone in a certain high school is at like a similar level of like academic prowess, basically. So I happened to go to a school that had like a hard entrance exam and was meant for people who wanted to go to a good college. So all the kids were like super serious, basically nerdy people who just like studied all the time and like didn't do anything fun on the weekends. And
boring.
So, yeah, there was that and the fact that I didn't speak Japanese very well. They didn't speak English. And so they were friendly to me, but I couldn't really, like, become friends with them, like, become pals because communicating was so difficult, right? Like, they had to talk to me like a baby for me to understand anything. And then a lot of times I couldn't really express what I wanted to say in return. So I ended up kind of, like, also, it had to do with my personality as well. I'm, like, an introvert. So I wasn't, like, if someone else was, like, an extrovert and they were in the same situation, they might have been able to like overcome the language barrier and just like, you know, communicate with hand movements and good vibes. But for me, I like, that was like not my forte. So I kind of at a certain point early on just gave up like having my Ryaju in Japan, if you know like what that is. And instead just like go to the library and just read light novels all day and try to get good at reading Japanese. And that was what I did for most of my time in Japan.
Well, now you are good at Japanese. Are you like, what are your expectations? Do you think it's going to be like just a totally different story from last time?
Well, I think it's going to be completely different. I mean, it's impossible to even compare because this time, I mean, I'm an adult. I live on my own. Like I have some money. And in fact, right now, the yen is super weak compared to the dollar. And so like, you know how normally like 100 yen is about $1?
Yeah.
Like last time I checked, like 140 yen was $1. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Well, anybody looking to import stuff now sounds like the time. God damn.
I know. Yeah, it's crazy. So my money will be worth like 40% more in Japan, basically. So
dude, that rocks.
Yeah, it's like the perfect time. So I'm going to be like mostly on my own. I also have a lot of friends that I met online, or also like when I was at college, I made friends with a lot of Japanese foreign exchange students so I can go and hang out with them. So yeah, I mean, I kind of just see myself like, yeah, I'll have a lot of friends, a lot of things to do. Probably, hopefully, a lot of opportunities will kind of, you know, show up. So I think this could be my like. Finally, I think hopefully I will get to have my Ryaju at last. Amazing. I don't want to jinx myself, of course, but
I think you're going to do great, and I'm looking forward to the content that comes out of it. Matt,
thank you.
Actually fighting Japan from within.
Oh yeah, that's the way to do it, right?
Yeah. So
it's a Trojan mat.
Tell us all the places that we can find all the stuff that you do online.
Yeah, so I mean, mostly just YouTube and Twitter. Like my YouTube channel, Matt vs. Japan. Same thing on Twitter. For a while, I was working on a project called Refold, which you can find at refold.la. And that's kind of where I really took all my language learning methodology and put it into like a clean, neat package that you can just follow to get fluent in Japanese. So if you're like we didn't end up talking about the specifics of like, okay, I want to learn Japanese, what do I actually do? So that's probably a good place to kind of check out if you are serious about actually learning Japanese. And I'll also say that a lot of people in the community, it's kind of interesting because First of all, I think there's really a certain type of person that wants to learn Japanese. Like, I'd say a huge portion of my audience, they got into Japanese from anime, as did I originally. And a lot of these people, they don't necessarily care about speaking Japanese or going to Japan. A lot of them just think it would be cool to be able to watch their anime without subtitles and read their manga untranslated. And that's, in a way, if that's your goal, then it's even more achievable, because learning to speak is pretty challenging, whereas learning to understand, it doesn't take quite as long. So I'd say, just to put any numbers for anyone to think about, like, if you are willing to dedicate 2 years of your life to like doing nothing but Japanese for those 2 years, you can get to the point where after that you can watch all your content without subtitles, and you'll never need subtitles again. And like I said, that does have some caveats. Like, you won't be able to watch like Phase Zero by the end of those 2 years, but you'll have so many shows by the end of those 2 years that you can just you'll have plenty to watch, and the more you watch, the better you'll get, and then you'll work your way to like Phase Zero and all the hardest shows.
I've been at the level for a while of I can watch shows for babies. I can maybe handle some Pokemon without subtitles, but I'm working my way up. Also, a good strat, you can find like live streams of Japanese television. I've like just left TV Tokyo on all day a few times, and it's an interesting way to pick up on like, you know, what Japanese is being like it's probably the Japanese that is being heard the most is like whatever's being said on like the biggest channels in Japan, you know. So like I feel like nothing could quite naturalize you, you know, from a distance as quickly as like just actually watching straight up Japanese TV broadcast.
True, although you'll have to sit through all the crazy sound effects and commercial jingles and all that
I like
stuff.
all that stuff. I love getting to watch the Japanese Takati ads and stuff that play on TV Tokyo. And they also will play like a lot of like Makoto Shinkai movies and stuff like that. Like, there are certain anime that are mainstream enough that they actually just come on TV all the time, you know, which is pretty fun.
One other thing I'll say, if you want a little sneak peek into like the underbelly of the Japanese learning community, that's not really, it's not anything bad or anything, but if you want to know like how hardcore some people go to try to optimize this process. So a lot of times people in the community, we talk about active immersion versus passive immersion. So active immersion is like when you're sitting down and you're trying to consume something in Japanese and you're giving your full attention to it. Whereas passive is kind of when you just leave it on in the background while you do something else. Like, you know, if you go for a walk or you're making a sandwich, you just listen to Japanese in the background. And generally, we think about it that passive immersion is not as helpful or beneficial as active, but it still is worth something, especially when you combine it together. And so what I used to do, and what a lot of people do now, is you'll sit down and you'll watch an anime episode, let's say, and you'll kind of look up the words you don't know. You might make some flashcards. And at the end of it, people have created software where you basically input an anime episode file and the accompanying subtitle file. And it spits out an MP3 file that basically used the timing information from the subtitle file to remove any dead space where no one was talking. So you have this condensed audio file where the entire thing only consists of dialogue. Like if there's ever an action scene where like basically anytime no one says anything for longer than like 5 seconds, then it will just cut out that whole portion. So like a 22-minute anime might get down to like 10 minutes in length, like 10, 13 minutes. And then they will listen to that on repeat passively in the background while they do other things. And because they already watched it once, you kind of know what's happening and you kind of you can see it in your mind's eye. And it's just totally efficient because there's no dead space from like battle scenes or anything like that.
That is fascinating, and it's got me thinking about the idea, like, even removed from doing it that extreme where, like, you make it a 10-minute audio file, like, just watching the same episode over and over again, you know, eventually you're going to know the layer, like, the first time you watch something when you don't understand Japanese, there's, like, an amount of you reading the subtitles to yourself inside your own brain, like, that drowns out actually hearing the Japanese, and that was the case for me for like a lot of my early anime viewing. Was like I wasn't really hearing what they were saying. I was hearing my own voice reading back to me. And then at some point when, you know, it got to where I don't have to like read the subtitles because I process them more quickly and I'm like paying more attention to the dialogue, and it's more like the subtitles are a supplement, like to fill in the gaps of what I don't understand about what I'm hearing. But like, yeah, once you rewatch it and you already know the dialogue, you'll get to a point where like, well, I know what they're saying. I don't need subtitles. And yeah, like now you know what all those words mean because you watch the episode until you like, you know, those just whatever words happen to be in that episode, you're going to know the definitions of after that much exposure. So that is a really interesting learning method for sure.
Yeah, like one of my, like the way that I learned is I combined that with, like, I made big use of the dictionary and a program called Anki. I don't know if you've ever if you're familiar with that software, but
I am not.
It's what's called a spaced repetition program or spaced repetition software, and it's the most famous. There's many different software that do the same thing, but this one is open source and free and the most used within the community. Basically, it's a program where you make your own flashcards. Like you type out or copy and paste in what you want on the front of the flashcard and the back of the flashcard. And then when you review it, the software asks you like, how well did you know this thing? Like not at all, a little bit, pretty well, or it was easy. And it uses that feedback you give it to basically determine how often you should study each of your cards. And it has this algorithm so that it basically knows when the last time you reviewed something was and how well you know it, and it uses that to determine the next time that you should review it so that you don't forget anything. And so if you study with this and you review with it every day, then you can learn lots of words like really efficiently. So like what I personally did was I would make 10 of these cards every day, 10 new Japanese words, and I'd just be reading light novels or watching anime. When there was a word I didn't know, I would just take that whole sentence and put it on the front of a flashcard, and then I'd put the definition of the word on the back of the flashcard. So I'd make 10 of those a day, and then in addition to the 10 new cards, the program would assign me like 60 cards to review out of my collection. And some of those were cards that I hadn't seen for a week, some I hadn't seen for a month, some I hadn't seen in like multiple years. It's like keeping track of that for me. And I did that for 5 years straight, which led to me having over 15,000 cards. And at that point, I knew like more words than some Japanese people did.
15,000.
Wow.
That's
That's
impressive.
impressive.
But it's just 10 a day, right? It's all just about that consistency, doing a little bit every single day. And it just really adds up. And so for me, that's kind of like my specialty in Japanese is I have like this huge vocabulary now because like I would read like Bakemonogatari. I know every single word in Bakemonogatari. I've memorized every single one through this flashcard program. And so, and that's the funny thing is like, there's a lot of Japanese words where like, I can tell you exactly where I learned it. Like I could tell you the scene of the show that I learned it from because I have a flashcard for it. So it like is, locked in my memory. So that was the way that I really did it. For me, it was a matter of like tons of input, like reading light novels, watching anime, and then I would make these just 10 cards every day out of the stuff I was consuming. And I got really good at understanding that way. And once I was really good at understanding, then speaking came pretty naturally because I just had to do that thing that I talked about earlier, where I just asked myself, okay, what would a Japanese person say in the situation? Yeah. And I'd seen so much input, my brain would naturally be like, oh, what about this? What about this? And so that's how I did it. But I have another friend who is just as good as me and better in some regards. And he didn't use any flashcards or use any dictionary. He literally just like watched an anime with subtitles, and then he'd immediately watch the same episode with no subtitles. And he just basically watched anime for like 10. He did that for like 10 hours a day for a couple years, and he got really good that way. So really the key is that you need to make the input comprehensible to you so that your brain can like learn to understand it. And you can do that with English subtitles, or you can do it with the dictionary like I did. There's like a lot of different options, but yeah, it just comes down to like get lots of input, understand the input, and then your brain does most of the work for you.
Yeah. Duolingo functions kind of similarly to what you were describing with the flashcards, where like it just keeps bringing stuff back up to you and like trying to reteach you like that stuff, It's worked pretty well for me getting back into like remembering everything. Like I had within a couple days like caught up to where I had been in Japanese 3 in high school, like just because it was like relearning to ride a bike or whatever. Like, I haven't done this in 10 years, but how do you forget how to do it, So like, it was like the feeling of like getting back into it, but I've been so busy I haven't actually kept up with it. So that's been the biggest thing holding me back from learning Japanese is always just I prioritize other things too much. Like it definitely takes a level of determination and like selecting it as the thing you're going to do. I would say like the reason that, like, because I've known about your sort of full immersion methodology for a while, and I've always thought, like, well, that's obviously the best way to learn Japanese fast. I just have to, like, make space in my life to actually do that. And that's, like, sort of the challenge that you propose to people right up front is, like, look, don't even tell yourself you're going to do this unless you understand that you have to spend 10,000 hours on it.
Yeah, totally. And that's why I think, like, most of the people in the community who are like me and have succeeded, they generally had a period of time in their life for a couple years when it was almost all they were doing. Like, they were just obsessed with it, and they did everything else in their life, the bare minimum, to spend as much time as possible doing Japanese. And so a lot of times I get asked by people, like, do I have to do that? Or can I be more moderate? Could I just do, like, 3 hours a day, 4 hours a day, which is still a lot to spend on a hobby every single day, right? Yeah. But it's still possible to have, like, a job and a life and cut out 3 to 4 hours if you're really dedicated. And I always answer to those people asking, like, can I still get fluent that way? Like, I think you totally can. I just think that realistically it's harder. Like, it's easy
harder,
to just
it'll take longer, and
I mean, it's easier to do one thing all the time, and then because you don't have to manage your time, right? If all you do is Japanese, then you never have to ask yourself, like, should I do Japanese right now, or should I hang out with my friend right now? The answer is always just no, I'll just do Japanese. And I also think that's why, like, monks, they go on meditation retreats where they just do nothing but meditate for, like, weeks or months in a row. I think that's just in a way it makes it easier. It sounds harder because it's like, oh, you're going so hardcore. But in a way, I think it actually is probably the easiest way, ultimately.
I understand what you mean. It is the easiest way, and if you do it another way, you're making it hard for yourself, like, and you think you're, like, making space for it in your life, but really you're just taking away from your life to do something not to the extent you could be. I
mean, I don't want to discourage anybody to try that method, because, I mean, for a lot of people, it's just not an option to dedicate their life to it, right? And so their only option is to make time for it. So I totally think it's possible. And I would encourage anyone to do it, but just like
it's also not necessarily everyone's goals to be like to have your 15,000 word vocabulary either.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm definitely an extreme example.
Yeah, like so if it seems intimidating, remember you don't have to be fully fluent to, like, move to Japan or, like, continue. No.
In fact, most people who live in Japan don't speak Japanese, and this is surprising to some people. I would imagine not surprising to you, but it's. Apparently, I mean, I hear this firsthand, but I also talk to a lot of people who've lived in. I mean, I hear this secondhand, but I talk to a lot of people who have lived in Japan. But people move to Japan. They make an effort to learn Japanese for a little bit, but then what happens is basically Japan is just a pretty easy country to live in, even if you don't know Japanese, because things are in English and they accommodate you. And so, like, when I was in Japan, there was a teacher, an English teacher, who was American. And he had been living in Japan for 10 years, and he had a Japanese wife and half Japanese kids, and he spoke less Japanese than you do, Trixie. So,
that's fascinating.
Like, don't think that going to Japan will automatically make you good at Japanese. Because the more likely scenarios, instead of getting good at Japanese, you get good at getting by without Japanese. It's like
That's hilarious.
By default, you build the wrong skill. So it's kind of like, if you can't get good at Japanese in America, you probably can't get good in Japan either. That said, if you just want to live in Japan, like, for example, PewDiePie, right? He's probably going to have an amazing time in Japan, and he's probably never going to get good at Japanese, but it doesn't really matter. So it just depends on your goals.
I'm really glad you clarified all that, and I think we're going to wrap it up here now. Mint, thank you also for joining us.
Yes,
Mint Salad.
My pleasure. This was excellent to listen to. Wow.
Can you tell us about where to find you and everything?
All right. Well, you can find me on this channel, the ASC Presents channel, but also twitter.com/itsmintsalad. And then I have a bunch of links in my link tree. It's linktree.com/titsmintsalad. Linktur.e.
It's spelled like...
Yes.
Yeah.
The link is weird.
But yeah, linktur.e/titsmintsalad, and you'll get a whole bunch of fun stuff a whole bunch of very fun places to find Mint Salad. You can find me on the Yig Studio channel at Golden Witch Fire on all social media platforms, and I'm all over this ASE Presents channel as well. Famous legendary hip hop producer Cranberry Dave joined us earlier, and he produces the Sucker Punch music, which I am a part of, the supergroup. Mint, you're also in Sucker Punch, and we're in this podcast. I also am a part of the Jittery Zeitgeist Hip Hop Review review podcast on this channel. So yeah, you need to be subscribed here. You need to be subscribed to Matt vs. Japan and Yig Studio, and follow all of us on Twitter. Matt, thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was super fun.
All right, everybody, see you later.